Hello, and welcome to this session of the Globe Summit, the Boston Globe's annual summit. My name is Sabrina Shankman, and I am the climate reporter at the Boston Globe. Very happy to be here today. I will be moderating today's panel, What Might Delay Our Transition to Clean Energy, in which I'll be speaking with climate and clean energy advocates and leaders about the challenges ahead, but also about the opportunities and what they see as the path forward. So I'm thrilled to be joined today. I will go down the line. I've got Larry Cretion at the end here, Executive Director of Green Energy Consumers Alliance.
Hello.
Next to him is Elizabeth Turnbull Henry, who's President of the Environmental League of Massachusetts.
Hello.
And right here we have Mireille Bijani, who's Co-Executive Director of Slingshot. And as we talk, I'll let Mireille explain what that is, because it might not be as familiar of a name, but they're doing very interesting work here in Massachusetts. So, welcome.
Thank you.
And to those who are joining us here today or watching virtually, I would love to hear your questions too that you have for our folks here. So please, we're using the Slido app for that. So please feel free to send some questions in and I will do my best to get to them. So with that aside, we are off. Let's start with some numbers. Right now, according to state figures, 59% of electricity powering Massachusetts is carbon free. State law mandates that we get to 92% by the end of the decade, which is actually not that far away. So there's a lot to be done. And I'd love to hear from each of you about what the most significant development is that in your mind that has to happen in order to get us there. And we can just go right down the line. Larry, we'll start with you.
Well, we need to have a lot more offshore wind. It's actually this week we're seeing the construction of wind turbines at the Vineyard Wind Project. And there's projects happening up and down the coast. We need to solicit more. We've had a couple setbacks where the state put out procurement and the numbers didn't work out, but you're just going to keep at it. Offshore wind's the biggest lever we have, but in case it's delayed, we just got to pour it on with solar, and we've got to be more efficient with our use of electricity in order to get to the number.
Yeah, all right. What about you, Elizabeth?
I mean, plus one. Offshore wind is going to be the backbone of New England's clean energy transition. Estimates say that by 2050, barring some breakthrough in fusion or some technology that's on the promising but only on the horizon, it's going to be likely 1 out of every 2 electrons coming from wind off of our coast. And so, talk about the economic development opportunities that are associated. But we need to double down on our commitment to offshore wind and be bringing that online in a timely and responsible way. I'll also, I'm really pleased to see all of the focus on siting and permitting, trying to be thoughtful about how we site and permit all of the energy infrastructure that we need, and really, I'm hopeful that our state and regional leaders can be maintaining that commitment to permitting and siting reform.
Yeah, right. What about Mireille?
Yeah, and I echo both of what Larry and Elizabeth said, and want to especially build on Elizabeth's point about siting. So Slingshot is an environmental justice organization that works alongside communities most impacted by environmental health threats to take aim at polluters and build community power, and we work across the region. And in working with these communities that are the ones home to a lot of the polluting infrastructure in our fossil fuel system currently, or the ones that are going to be receiving new transmission lines or offshore wind terminals, what we're seeing over and over again is a few different things. One is they definitely want to be much more involved in the conversation, and that ties into the siting reforms that Elizabeth was talking about. We need to be making sure that in going through the clean energy transition, we're not repeating the patterns of the fossil fuel industry, that we are putting the communities front and center in what's going to happen and ensuring that they are benefiting from this transition. And a big part of that in terms of a change we need to see is at the regional level, our grid operator, ISO New England, is not being the partner that we currently need at the state level to accomplish our goals.
And we're going to get into ISO New England a lot more in a little bit. So put a pin in that, because I do have some questions related to that I want to get to. But I mean, before we move away from offshore wind, it's been a turbulent time in offshore wind, and also a very exciting time. I mean, we were about to have the first industrial scale offshore wind project in Massachusetts, which is a really big deal. It has taken so long and so much work to get here, and yet, even at this exciting moment, there are also some really big challenges. Larry, you kind of mentioned procurement and that there's been this issue, but for those who aren't quite as steeped in this conversation around how this all works, can we kind of, set the table with what the challenges are for offshore wind right now?
So one challenge, of course, is to site it. Many projects have been sited already, but then there has to be a long-term contract. It's usually initiated by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts or another state, and the utilities have to go out and take bids for projects. The contracts have to be long-term because these wind turbine projects are very expensive capital outlays. And they need to be paid off over time. Once you get them up and running, of course, then the wind resource is pretty affordable, and that's why we love it. But that's the challenge in those procurements and putting them out there. We had a little bit of a snap where the supply chain problem and then the inflation increases, rises in interest rates. A lot goes to Vladimir Putin attacking Ukraine. All that messed up not just in the United States, but around the world. Has put a damper on offshore wind development. But I like to think that it's transitory. Mm-hmm. We have to think of it that way, and we need to keep putting out the solicitations. And now there's talk about having more regional cooperation, maybe to do projects that are even larger than if one state did it by themselves. Mm-hmm. That gets some economies of scale going and helps reduce the risk. And the larger you do, you get some economies of scale in the transmission backbone. And so we just have to stay at it.
Right, and when you say the transmission backbone, what you're referring to is the fact that we currently don't have enough wires and ability to just move large amounts of energy and electricity around the region. And I think an interesting collaboration, like what you're talking about, is now this is the onshore wind realm, but between Maine and Massachusetts, yep, with the onshore wind project at the top of Maine, which was sort of one of the first big intrastate projects that we've heard about recently. It sounds like there's more of those in the works. Is that?
The legislature did a good thing. In the last climate bill, they did put in a provision that said that Massachusetts could be part of a 1,000 megawatt project, the largest in New England onshore. Mm-hmm. And so we should be getting some of that power eventually. And we need that in addition or instead of other offshore wind projects.
Yeah. Elizabeth, you mentioned how many electrons are expected to come from offshore wind. There's this very common refrain that comes from those who are not necessarily working in the clean energy industry, a bit of skepticism about the ability of wind to deliver that. There's this, you hear regularly, well, what happens when the wind's not blowing and when the sun doesn't shine? And I'm curious what your response is to that when people say that.
Yeah, I mean, it's true that wind is an intermittent resource. There are times when it doesn't blow. That said, if you look at there's all these beautiful wind maps that NOAA and other government agencies put out, and blue is sort of light wind, and it gets, as you move up the color spectrum, you get bright red in these pockets where the wind blows hard and often. And so when you look at a map of the world, New England has this bright red, man. It jumps off the page as being a terrific place. And you couple that with the shallow waters off of our continental shelf here in Massachusetts and all of the coastal population, you have the Massachusetts coast is like one of the world's best places to be building these turbines. And offshore wind has fallen down the cost curve considerably since those early days of Cape Wind. A lot of this is driven by innovation that's come from all the deployment happening in Europe and other parts of the world. And so we're in this moment now where offshore wind is sort of competitive with some of these other, like a traditional combined cycle natural gas plant, for example, which is really exciting.
Yeah.
So you're seeing, you're seeing cost competitive offshore wind, and that's really caught the attention of a lot of states. In fact, Massachusetts was the first state in the nation to direct its utilities to buy a big chunk of offshore wind, but it kickstarted this whole revolution, and states up and down the Atlantic coast and increasingly the Gulf and California are also eyeing offshore wind as a resource for their communities as well. As Larry mentioned, all of this demand plus the war in Ukraine and inflationary pressure has meant that offshore wind has starting to get more expensive, and I think that's making people a little bit nervous. I hear that. I see, I wish the cost curve was continuing to, in this endless descent. I do think, though, as Larry said, I think it's going to be transitory. I think we're, with the deployment of any new technology, I think you see lumps along the way, but Long-term, offshore wind, I think, is really going to deliver for the New England grid. And by the way, these supply chain and inflation pressures are crunching every kind of energy infrastructure. Like if you were going to build a new gas plant, God forbid, it's going to be more expensive than it was a few years ago, right? And that the last thing I'll say is like, gosh, climate change is going to be expensive, right? And so I hope that we can ground this conversation in offshore wind pricing against the backdrop of how unconscionably expensive inaction on climate change is.
Yeah. I mean, there has been so much economic analysis of what the cost of inaction is. How much, I mean, I know you were all watching kind of the conversations happening about this at the state level and the federal level. How much do you think that's actually being considered, like weighed the cost of a project versus the cost of inaction?
I don't think we're really doing that math yet. I think most recently, we are building a fossil fuel powered plant, as you alluded to, Elizabeth, in Peabody right now. It's going to be coming online, unfortunately, in the next few months. And in the calculations for that, I don't think that math was being done in evaluating that project versus alternatives and in evaluating that project and its impacts on the community. Both short-term health impacts, et cetera, and long-term in terms of exacerbating the climate crisis. So I think it's an abstract concept in a lot of ways still for a lot of people, unfortunately, even though just this summer, in the last few months, we've seen the climate crisis is here. We have the hottest months on record. We have record flooding across our region, especially devastating in Vermont and Western Mass. I think it hasn't quite crystallized as something that people can quantify in the way that we are used to quantifying our electric markets and building new projects, et cetera. I don't think we've factored that into the bottom line to the extent that we need to in terms of really making this transition and valuing the benefits that clean energy bring beyond the cheaper costs of that facility itself.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking about it in the context of this right now, but I mean, is there like a legislative fix that could potentially change that? Like change the requirement that there be some consideration of what the cost comparing to a lack of action?
There's a slew of bills I think we're all working on that try to reset that calculus and all that. The problem with clean energy is that it requires a whole lot of proactive decision making. Like it doesn't happen on its own, and so we've just got to keep making the decisions to buy the renewable energy, to incentivize the EVs and the heat pumps and all that. Whereas the status quo is kind of easy. You don't make a decision and you just keep getting it. And I just got to remind people of the skyrocketing prices we had for natural gas and electricity last winter. And that was because we didn't make any decisions. We didn't move fast enough on the offshore wind. If we had had the Vineyard Wind project in over a year ago, we would have had much lower prices. And so I'll be honest with you, there are legislators who are worried about adding to the bill when they think about clean energy, and because they know that's a decision they have to make. And so we just got to push back on that.
You know, something Larry said a few minutes ago too about proactive planning and regional cooperation is actually something that the government can do that is pretty inexpensive, right? Planning is not, is not capital intensive, but it can really unlock tremendous economies of scale and help rationalize all of these points of interconnect for new clean energy and help give developers some certainty to lower the risk of their projects and so on. So I know many of us are working in coalition to try to further encourage the Healy Driscoll administration and leaders in other states to be working together and to be having a long-term plan for how we triple the New England grid, more or less, and power our economy with clean energy. That planning is so important.
Yeah. So where I sit, it seems like a no-brainer, like you would just plan it, right? Why wouldn't you? You know this is coming. Massachusetts is very proactive on climate change compared to many other states in the country. So why hasn't that, or why isn't that happening? Like, what have been the barriers to doing that work?
Mireille, do you want to take this?
Well, this is where I would jump into ISO New England as a
Go get it.
All right.
That's right.
So I think a big piece of this at the regional level is our grid operator, ISO New England. They are the ones who do a lot of the planning at the highest, for the scale beyond state to state projects. And they are the ones who plan several years ahead of time and who conduct studies on what the grid's going to look like 5 years from now, 10 years from now, decades from now, especially as we're thinking about the clean energy transition and the climate crisis. And thus far, they haven't been the partner that we've needed. They have been dragging their heels on the transition to clean energy. And I think haven't really been taking into account the full extent of climate and environmental justice in the reports and studies that they've been doing. The scope has been rather limited to economic costs and electricity markets, et cetera, and we can't make decisions that reflect our current reality and the climate crisis if the studies that are being done don't evaluate the costs of the grid beyond the dollar signs in terms of costs on people's health, costs on the environment, and on our future. And so that's a big thing that we need to shift the mentality of these regional bodies to make sure that they are collecting the information that allows us to make the decisions that are more appropriate for this transition. Yeah. So I think that's a big part of the planning that's been lacking.
Okay.
Even within our own state, though, what frustrates me for a long time, and especially even today, is the utilities do most of the planning, and the product you get from after they produce a plan is something that essentially is good for them, and not necessarily in the public interest. And so the states and advocates are in the position of having to react to that. Meanwhile, a lot of time has gone by, and then it's always a game of trying to figure out how to provide the right incentive to the utilities so that they can get us to net zero, and we should be doing it a different way.
But just to push back on what both of you are saying, and I hear these complaints in my inbox all the time. Yeah. I've talked to you all about some of these concerns for stories that I've written. But I also talk with ISO New England, I also speak with utilities. And the pushback that I hear from them would be that their priority is reliability. And so, that is project number one for them, that it is a huge, obviously a big problem if people can't turn their lights on or they're cold in the wintertime. And the other one that I hear is in terms of the utilities leading some of the analysis and planning is that they have that expert staff in-house, and therefore it makes the most sense because they know what their grid looks like, they know what the demand looks like, and so they're best able to analyze how this transition should go. And I'm curious, if anybody wants to take a response to that.
Yeah, I'll jump in with the reliability piece first, and then I'll let Larry address the utility piece. I think the first thing to really note is that reliability and renewable energy are not mutually exclusive. And I think that's something that ISO New England and other players try to push forward as the narrative, because the people who have decision-making power in those spaces are benefiting from the current system and want, like Larry said, the utilities want what's good for them, and they're going to put forward the narrative that allows them to keep their pipelines going, to keep the status quo that they're making a profit off of. And so they don't necessarily want to say that reliability and renewable energy can go hand in hand, and therefore they need to make some big time changes. I also think that reliability is interesting to use that as a reason not to transition to renewable energy when reliability is going to be tremendously at risk as the climate crisis continues to get worse. When we get hotter and hotter days or colder and colder days and worse storms knocking out transmission infrastructure or making it harder for the grid to meet electricity demand, by not acting on this transition, the ISO New England and the utilities are actually putting reliability at risk because they're making the conditions they have to operate in more challenging.
It would be foolish to ignore the facts and the data that the utilities have, but really that's what we need from them. We don't need their spin, and we don't need to put our public interest second to their goals. They're representing shareholders when they bring us any sort of a plan, and we need to just remember that. And so there's. And the other thing that's confounding is we've got multiple investor-owned utilities for gas and electric, and they come up with different approaches, and we've got to sort that out. And it's a big factor in why things are moving more slowly.
Now, how is the Healey-Driscoll administration approaching this differently through their Department of Public Utilities than the Baker administration was? Because it seems like that relationship has shifted a little bit.
Well, I think the Department of Energy Resources, the sort of the policy arm of the Healey administration, is doing a great job. They're looking at it from the state's perspective and having advocates in the utilities have to sort of think about that. And so I'm happy with them so far. The DPU, I think we're waiting to see, honestly.
All right. So I'm going to, one of the questions that came through from the audience had to do with my 59% number that I used at the beginning, which, Larry, you know how hard I had to work to get that 59% number for the story that I wrote on the transition of the grid. But they're saying it seems high. Is the math fuzzy due to carbon offsets, or is it accurate? Which, since you were so crucial in my figuring that out, do you want to help? When we say 59% carbon free, right? We're not saying clean, we're saying carbon free. What does that mean?
Yeah, so that number includes hydro from Quebec. It includes old hydro that's scattered around New England. It includes the renewables. We have a renewable portfolio standard in Massachusetts that we've had it for a long time. And so all that nuclear power is part of that 59%. So those are all the ingredients that come to that. And then they add a couple things that are arguably maybe 10% of that 59% is kind of debatable as to whether or not it should be considered clean.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it was interesting when I was trying to get to that number of how many different ways people account for what's clean and what's powering our grid. There are very many different ways to interpret it, which is sort of surprising because of how kind of central it is to policy, which makes me think about how we think about the numbers and the goals, right? We have these very clear cut greenhouse gas emissions in Massachusetts 50% below 1990 levels by the end of this decade, get to net zero by 2050. I mean, how important are these numbers at the end of the day?
I mean, I think they're hugely important, right? You can't manage what you can't measure. And so we, ELM, and actually in partnership with a whole lot of advocates, was really pushing for the Next Generation Roadmap law, which passed in 2021, which set legally binding emissions reduction goals for the Commonwealth that included both interim targets for 75% reduction by 2040 and 50% reduction by 2030, which is aligned with what the UN would recommend. And also, I think crucially, sector-based targets. So we need to have across the 6 key emission sectors, transportation, electric grid, buildings, and so on, actual reductions in those sectors as well. And so the Commonwealth has remarkably a pretty clear roadmap for where we need to go and pretty clear benchmarks for what success looks like. And I'm thrilled with that. I'm troubled that we're not hitting those benchmarks, but it's not for lack of knowing where we need to go. So
okay,
big believer in metrics and numbers.
But let's go to that point of that, troubled that we're not getting to that. So when you say that, what are you referring to specifically?
Well, I mean, you wrote a great story about how we need to electrify 1 million homes by 2030 if we're going to be on track to hitting those reductions in the building sector. And how many had we electrified, Sabrina?
Well, it's an older number. I don't know the number currently, but I was looking at the time at how many we had done in the year prior, and it was like 420,
yeah,
I think,
right.
was the number. Yeah.
But I mean, absent that 1 million home goal, that would have been harder for you to write that story, right?
So the numbers count. Back to your other question, we get to net zero by phasing out gasoline-powered cars and fossil fuel heating systems one by one. And the fossil fuel generation, we got to eliminate that. So we do actually have to count those things and make progress towards them.
And I agree that the goals are tremendously important, and also the qualitative pieces that go with them are important too, in terms of as we're moving towards those goals and hitting them, what does that mean in terms of experience on the ground for frontline communities, for those who are being supported in electrifying their homes or not, or those who are potentially being left behind, being left to shoulder the costs of the fossil fuel infrastructure that is increasingly becoming stranded assets. So I think those goals, as Elizabeth mentioned, you can't manage what you can't measure, and also we need to be taking into account as we're making progress on that goal, on those goals, how is that also impacting communities across the Commonwealth?
Yeah. Okay. I want to shift gears a little bit because we talked about offshore wind and some of the challenges there and also where things might get better. But I want to talk about solar a bit. So solar plays an important role. It's such a different beast in that we are talking about tons of very small projects as opposed to a handful of very large ones. So what are how's it going? And what are the challenges that are kind of standing in the way of that kind of moving even faster? I don't know if anybody wants to jump in on that.
When I think of solar, a new study came out recently that said that we have plenty of space on developed land or rooftops in Massachusetts to meet our solar goals. We don't have to do it by, cutting down all the forest in order to have a lot of solar. So that's great news. The interconnection is a backlog of that. People trying to develop projects have to negotiate with the utilities just to get the thing interconnected. But here's something pretty exciting. Massachusetts will apply to the federal government under the Inflation Reduction Act by mid-October, a program called Solar for All. We're eligible for $250 million of solar just for low-income people. That will be a game changer. In Massachusetts is working hard at that now, but I think we're going to get that $250 million, and we'll be able to see to it that people who are low income will be able to benefit from the growth of clean energy.
And so that is it. Do you know how that works? Like, is that if you qualify as a low income resident, could you then apply for those funds and then get panels on your roof, or is it more like affordable housing developers?
A combination of things. The state's got they've shown us a draft of it. They're working on it. Multifaceted. They're going to touch on public housing. They're going to try to make it community solar and rooftop solar for people in affordable housing. That's a big component. They're going to do it as efficiently and reach as many people as they can. It's a pretty good plan.
Yeah. So Elizabeth, when you look to 2050 and imagine what solar looks like in Boston, in Massachusetts, like paint a picture of what do you think? How does it work?
Yeah. I mean, I envision if I was running the world, I would envision a paradigm where the easiest places to build were previously disturbed land, rooftops, carports, where every school and municipal building that could accommodate solar had it, where our building codes made it very, made solar readiness default across the Commonwealth. I talk to solar developers a lot, and many of them are leaving Massachusetts because it's really hard. It's hard to interconnect projects here. We have the sclerotic utility interconnection process, which is an embarrassment. I think the Haley Driscoll administration seems to really understand some of the pain points with solar and seems committed to rolling out a next generation of policies that will help make it easier to build, and particularly to build on places of low ecological value. But Larry's right. I mean, it's not for lack of space. Mm-hmm. There's lots of other smaller barriers that are keeping solar from where it needs to be, and I'm hopeful that in the next few years we can really ratchet up building in these previously disturbed lots and on impervious surfaces, so that we can take some of the pressure off of the places of higher ecological value and make it less common for communities to feel this tension between should we put solar on this old farm or not, because we have so many other places where it could go. That said, I want to be clear. ELM's view is that there some utility scale greenfield development is going to be necessary if we're going to be hitting our solar goals, and so we're not categorically opposed to those kinds of bigger greenfield projects, but they should sort of be a last resort.
Okay. And actually, someone from the audience wanted to know if there are incentives specifically to put solar roofs on parking lots, because it seems like a non-controversial win-win in their words. So did those exist currently in Massachusetts?
There are incentives. It's a little bit more expensive, so it's a little bit of a challenge. And then, but I think you're going to start seeing more and more of it in days ahead.
Okay. And Elizabeth, going back to what you said about the issues with interconnection, the interconnection queue, and Larry, you also mentioned the interconnection problems. I mean, what is a fix to that? What's the solution?
Well, I think some of it comes down to cost allocation and who pays for the interconnection. But our DPU recently just rate-based a slug of interconnection projects, meaning that those costs are sort of socialized across the ratepayers. Mm-hmm. That's interesting. I mean, it also I think we're all noticing the cost of electricity here in the Commonwealth and wanting to make sure that we are really not further burdening electric ratepayers here. We want electricity to be affordable and clean and reliable and abundant. And so I'm just, want to make sure that our policy measures aren't making our electricity bills go up with lots of additional adders. I mean, you think about this, you run the Green Energy Consumers Alliance, you think about this all the time, but I don't know if you have anything to add.
This is a planning function, really. A lot of the problems have to do with, the good news is we're growing solar pretty fast in Massachusetts, but we got to keep the grid upgraded at the right time. What we don't want is, like, if someone's going to come in with a solar project, we know that there's going to be 10 more projects behind it. We need to plan ahead for that. But ultimately, and this is will be the challenge, is when we make those investments to accommodate the renewable energy and the EVs and the heat pumps and all that, all those, it costs money up front, but there should be a payback to that. The solar is going to mean less transmission and distribution requirements down the road, right? It's going to mean less fossil fuel that we have to buy, and so on. And so there are benefits to the EVs and the heat pumps as well. So what we're looking for is, like, net benefits. Like, does it all make sense? Is it you got to spend a little bit of money in order to harvest the benefits.
Yeah. Shifting gears a little bit, we just have a couple of minutes left, but Mireille, I'm wondering if you might be able to address something that I hear sometimes. I was speaking with someone from the New England Power Generators Association a while ago, and so this would be an association that represents a lot of, like, the electric power generators and the fossil fuel ones too. So what they were saying to me is that we need to be doing better when it comes to siting decisions and incorporating environmental justice, but we also need to be making decisions a lot faster. And so how do we do that? And so I put that to him. Okay, so how do you do it? And he was like, I don't know, how do you do it? And so I'm curious, if you know, how do we do it? Like, what's the way forward here?
I wish I had the silver bullet for that question. It is a challenging one that is increasingly coming up. I think what I would say is being proactive and building trust as early as possible ultimately makes a process more streamlined. As we've seen with most recently the East Boston substation, where that's a piece of electric infrastructure that we know we're going to need more substations. No one's arguing against more substations as a concept in the growth of the grid, but where we put them is important, and how we engage with the surrounding communities is important. And in the case of East Boston, that community engagement didn't happen in the proactive and collaborative way that it should have. And that project has dragged on for years and years. In contrast, there is a separate battery storage project happening in East Boston that is moving forward very seamlessly because there was early conversation with community members. They were consulted, their feedback was listened to, and the company is offering technical expertise and in exchange, weighing in with how they can help the community accomplish its own goals. And so there's a much more positive relationship there. And I think that's a big thing that we need to be thinking about is, as a result of the fossil fuel industry and all of the complications around our grid, there is a lack of trust between utilities, between project developers and community groups and residents. And we need to acknowledge that. We need to face that head on and be really proactive about rebuilding those relationships if we're going to be able to have conversations that don't take months and months or years and years. Because at the end of the day, everyone wants the clean energy transition to happen, but we want to do it in a way that is engaging those who are going to be impacted by that infrastructure.
Yeah. So my last question is sort of a lightning round question because we don't have a lot of time, but I'm very interested to hear your thoughts on this, which is, each of you coming down the line, what makes you optimistic about this transition?
The technology's there, and people are more and more people are getting the fact that we have a climate crisis, and what's lacking is policy.
Yeah. All right, let's.
We can fix that.
Right.
Yeah, we just have tremendous leadership at the city and state level. I mean, you heard Mayor Wu a couple of hours ago speaking so lucidly about making Boston a fossil fuel-free city. At the state level, we have just incredible leadership too. And so I think elections have consequences, leadership matters, and we have leaders who really want want Massachusetts to lead the nation on these issues and are putting both political capital and financial resources to help bring that to bear. So that helps me sleep.
All right, last word from you, Mireille.
Yeah, to complement the leadership that we have, I think we have tremendous momentum at the ground level. Residents are excited about this. They want to be engaged. They are informed and continuing to inform themselves further, and they want to be active stakeholders in the process. And I think that that's something that's really exciting and is a tool in our toolbox that we haven't fully tapped into yet.
All right, well, that is all the time we have for today. Larry, Mireille, Elizabeth, thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure speaking with you about this, and we really appreciate your time coming to join us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is the last day, but there are still some great sessions up ahead in the Globe Summit. And also, if you have missed any of our earlier panels, they are available on demand, and we hope you will check them out. Thank you so much for joining us today and for being part of our community here at the Globe Summit.